The doors of the great hall flew open before the herald could even finish calling the names, and every candle in the room seemed to flicker at once. Duke Alaric Ashwood walked in with a woman on his arm who was not his wife, and the music stopped so suddenly that the violinist's bow screeched against the strings. 300 guests turned as one. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Somewhere near the back, a plate slipped from a servant's hand and shattered on the marble floor, but nobody looked away long enough to notice. The woman beside the Duke was young, dressed in deep emerald silk that matched the Ashwood colors far too closely for it to be an accident. Her name was Elira Voss, and until that night she had been nothing more than a rumor whispered behind fans and folded letters. Now she was real, standing in the center of the most powerful room in the kingdom, her chin lifted, her eyes daring anyone to speak. At the far end of the hall, seated on a raised chair beside the empty seat that should have held her husband, sat Duchess Seraphina Ashwood. She did not gasp. She did not rise. She simply set down her wine glass, folded her hands in her lap, and watched her husband approach with the calm of someone who had already read the ending of a book everyone else was still holding. "My lords, my ladies," Alaric announced, his voice carrying across the hall with practiced confidence, though a thin line of sweat had already formed at his collar. "Allow me to present Lady Elira Voss, a dear and valued companion, whom I wish to welcome formally into the life of this court." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of an audience waiting to see who would break first. Seraphina rose. Every eye shifted to her. She smoothed the front of her deep blue gown, the one she had commissioned 3 weeks earlier for reasons she had told no one, and walked down the 3 shallow steps from the dais with unhurried grace. She crossed the entire length of the hall, her heels tapping softly against the marble, until she stood directly in front of Elira. For a long moment, the Duchess said nothing. She studied the younger woman's face the way a merchant studies a coin, checking for the false weight, the wrong shine. Then she smiled. "Welcome to Ashwood Court, Lady Voss," Seraphina said, her voice warm enough to fool anyone who did not know her well. "I have heard so very much about you." A ripple of confused murmurs spread through the crowd. This was not the reaction anyone had prepared for. Lord Edmund Clark, who stood near the wine table with his goblet frozen halfway to his mouth, leaned toward his companion and whispered that the Duchess had clearly lost her composure from grief. Lady Helena Grant, further along the wall, disagreed in a hushed voice, insisting that no woman smiled like that unless she was already 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room. Alaric himself looked more unsettled than pleased. He had expected tears. He had expected a scene he could later use to paint his wife as unstable and himself as the wronged party, freeing him to do exactly as he pleased without consequence. Instead, his wife was greeting his mistress as though she were a long-awaited guest of honor. "You are too kind, Your Grace," Elira said carefully, glancing at Alaric for guidance he did not offer. "Not kindness," Seraphina replied, still smiling. "Simply good manners. Come, let me introduce you properly to the court. It would be a shame for you to stand here all evening as a mystery when you could be known as a friend." She extended her arm, and after a heartbeat of hesitation, Elira took it. What followed stunned the hall even further. The Duchess walked Elira from group to group, introducing her by name and title as though she were sponsoring a young debutante into society, rather than the woman her husband had paraded in as his companion. She spoke of Elira's talents, her family's modest but respectable lineage, even a small detail about her fondness for painting landscapes, information Seraphina should not have known unless she had been quietly gathering it for some time. Alaric trailed behind them, caught between relief that no public disaster was unfolding and a growing unease he could not name. He had built his plan around his wife's expected humiliation. He had imagined Seraphina weeping in front of the court, giving him grounds to claim the marriage had broken beyond repair, clearing the path for Elira to eventually take her place. Instead, Seraphina was making his companion look like a woman under the Duchess's own protection. Near midnight, When the musicians finally resumed and couples returned to the floor, Serafina excused herself from Alira's side and crossed to where the Dowager Duchess, Alaric's mother, stood watching everything with narrowed eyes. "You are playing a dangerous game, child," the older woman murmured, not looking directly at Serafina, her gaze fixed instead on her son laughing too loudly near the refreshment table. "I am not playing anything, mother," Serafina answered, using the title she had earned through 10 years of marriage rather than blood. "I am simply being a gracious hostess." "Alaric expected you to break." "I know," Serafina said. "That is precisely why I did not." The dowager studied her daughter-in-law for a long moment, searching for cracks in the composure and finding none. She had known Serafina since the girl was 17 years old, arriving at Ashwood Court with little more than her family's name and a stubborn refusal to be underestimated. In 10 years, the dowager had never once seen that resolve falter, not even now, not even here. "What are you planning?" the dowager asked quietly. Serafina's smile did not reach her eyes this time. "Nothing yet, mother. Tonight I am only welcoming a guest." Across the room, Alira found herself surrounded by a cluster of noblewomen who, moments earlier, would have refused to acknowledge her existence. Now, under the apparent blessing of the Duchess herself, they peppered her with questions, complimented her gown, and asked after her family as though she had always belonged among them. Alira answered carefully, aware that something about this welcome did not sit right, though she could not name what unsettled her more, the warmth or the watchfulness behind it. She caught Serafina's eye once across the hall. The Duchess inclined her head slightly, the way one might acknowledge an opponent across a chessboard, and Alira felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of the crowded room. By the time the gala ended and guests began filing out into the cold night air, whispers had already begun to travel faster than carriages. Some said the Duchess had shown remarkable grace under humiliation. Others insisted grace had nothing to do with it, that a woman who smiled that widely while her husband flaunted his companion was either broken inside or building something far more dangerous than anyone in the hall could yet see. Alaric found his wife alone in the east corridor as the last of the guests departed, standing beside a tall window that overlooked the frost-covered gardens. She had removed her long gloves and was turning them over in her hands, as though examining them for the first time. "You surprised me tonight," he said, keeping his voice low, though there was no one left to overhear. "Did I?" Serafina did not turn to face him. "I expected tears, perhaps a scene." "I know you did." She finally looked at him, and for the first time that evening, something colder than politeness showed in her eyes. "You wanted the court to see me weak, Alaric. You wanted witnesses to my collapse so that when the time came, you could claim I had abandoned my duties as your wife, that I had grown unstable, unfit. It would have made everything so much easier for you, wouldn't it? A quiet dissolution of our marriage, no scandal attached to your name, and a clear path to place Lady Voss wherever you pleased." Alaric's jaw tightened. He had not expected her to see through his intentions so completely, let alone say them aloud with such calm precision. "That is not—" "Do not insult me by denying it," Serafina interrupted, though her tone never rose above a measured, even pitch. "I have spent 10 years learning to read you, husband. I know when you are planning something, the same way I know when a storm is coming by the way the birds go silent." "Then you understand why I brought her tonight." "I understand exactly why you brought her tonight," Serafina said. "What you do not yet understand is why I welcomed her." Something in her voice made Alaric take a half-step back, though he could not have explained why. He had married Serafina for practical reasons, an alliance between two old families, her dowry substantial enough to matter, her bloodline respectable enough to satisfy his mother. He had never loved her, not truly, and he had assumed, wrongly it seemed, that she had long since resigned herself to a marriage of convenience and quiet acceptance. "You will not stand in my way," he said, though the certainty in his voice had thinned considerably since the start of the conversation. "I have no intention of standing in your way, Alaric," Serafina replied, slipping her gloves back on with unhurried care. "I intend to walk directly beside you, so close that you will not see what is coming until it has already arrived." She left him standing alone in the corridor, his reflection staring back at him from the dark window glass, and for the first time in years, the Duke of Ashwood felt something he was entirely unfamiliar with. Not guilt, not regret. A small, unfamiliar fear, settling quietly into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. Alira, meanwhile, sat in the carriage Alaric had arranged to take her home, replaying the evening in her mind. She had come to the gala expecting to be scorned, perhaps even removed from the premises under the Duchess's orders. Instead, she had been welcomed, praised, folded into conversations she had never expected to join. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like being measured for something she did not yet understand, a fitting for a role whose purpose remained hidden from her. She thought of the moment their eyes had met across the hall, the small tilt of the Duchess's head, the flicker of something sharp behind the practiced warmth. Alira had grown up with little money, poor enough to recognize danger dressed in fine clothing, and every instinct she possessed told her that Seraphina Ashwood was not a woman who had simply accepted defeat with grace. She was a woman who had already begun to plan her next move, and Alira, whether she wished it or not, had just become a piece on her board. Back at Ashwood Manor, long after the last candle had been extinguished and the household had finally settled into uneasy sleep, Seraphina sat at her writing desk in the privacy of her chambers. She unlocked a small drawer hidden beneath a false panel, one she had installed herself 2 years earlier without her husband's knowledge, and withdrew a thin leather folder. Inside were letters, records, and a single yellow document bearing her father's seal, paper she had kept hidden and untouched for years, waiting for a moment she had always known would eventually come. She spread them carefully across the desk, studying each one by candlelight, her expression unreadable in the flickering glow. Whatever Alaric believed he had set into motion tonight by introducing his companion to the court, Seraphina had been preparing for this exact moment far longer than he could possibly imagine. She picked up her pen, dipped it in ink, and began to write a letter addressed to a solicitor in the capital, a man whose discretion she had already secured months in advance. Outside her window, the first hint of dawn began to touch the frost-covered gardens, and somewhere in the manor, unable to sleep, the Dowager Duchess stood at her own window, watching the pale light spread across the grounds and wondering, with a mixture of unease and something close to admiration, exactly what her daughter-in-law intended to do next. In the servants' quarters below the main house, the staff of Ashwood Manor gathered around a single lamp in the kitchen, too restless to sleep despite the late hour. Martha, the head housekeeper, poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the sheer strangeness of what she had witnessed while serving drinks in the hall. "I have worked in this house for 20 years, she said quietly, "and I have never seen the Duchess smile like that. Not once, not even on her wedding day." A young footman named Oliver, barely 18 and still new enough to the household to be shocked by anything, shook his head slowly. "I thought she would scream, or faint." "Everyone thought so." "That is because you do not yet understand her," Martha replied, setting the teapot down with a soft clink. "The Duchess does not scream. She has never once raised her voice in this house, not when the roof leaked over the west wing, not when the harvest failed 2 years running, not even when her own father passed and she received the news at breakfast. She simply sets down whatever she is holding and begins to think." "Think about what?" Oliver asked. Martha looked toward the ceiling, in the direction of the Duchess's private chambers, where a single candle still burned faintly against the dark window glass. "About whatever comes next," she said. "That is what worries me." Whatever comes next has been thought about for quite some time, long before tonight. Upstairs in a guest chamber prepared hastily for her, Alira Voss sat awake long after the household had gone quiet, staring at the ceiling above her borrowed bed. She had expected, if she was honest with herself, to spend this night in a rented room above a tailor's shop in the city, having been turned away from Ashwood Manor at the door by furious guards under the Duchess's command. Instead, she found herself given a proper chamber, warm blankets, and a servant assigned to see to her comfort. None of it felt like a kindness. It felt like a cage lined with silk. She rose from the bed and crossed to the window, looking out over the same frost-covered gardens the Duchess had gazed upon earlier that night. Somewhere below, a fox slipped between the hedges, quick and silent, gone before she could be certain she had truly seen it. Elira thought of her mother, back in the small village she had left 2 years earlier, and wondered what the older woman would say if she could see her daughter now, standing in a duke's manor, welcomed by a duchess whose husband had brought her there as a public declaration of betrayal. Her mother would have told her to run. Elira understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than anger ever could have, that running was no longer a simple option. She had stepped into something far larger than a love affair between herself and a duke. She had stepped into a war she had not known existed, fought with smiles and toasts instead of blades, and she had no idea yet which side, if any, she truly belonged to. Meanwhile, in the capital city 2 days' ride from Ashwood Manor, a solicitor named Gerald Finch sat in his modest office long after his clerks had gone home, reading a letter that had arrived that very evening by private courier. The seal on the envelope was one he recognized immediately, a seal he had not seen used in nearly 2 years, since the last time the Duchess of Ashwood had written to him under circumstances she had insisted remained strictly confidential. He broke the seal and read the letter twice, his expression growing more thoughtful with each line. When he finished, he set it down on his desk, removed his spectacles, and rubbed the bridge of his nose slowly. "So it begins," he murmured to the empty room, before rising to retrieve a locked box from beneath his desk, one that had sat untouched for nearly 2 years, waiting exactly for a night like this one. Back at Ashwood Manor, as the first pale light of morning crept over the eastern hills, Seraphina finally set down her pen. She read over the letter she had written one final time, folded it with careful precision, and sealed it with wax bearing her own family crest, not the Ashwood crest she had worn for a decade, but the crest of her birth family, one she had not used in official correspondence since her wedding day. She rang a small bell on her desk, and moments later a trusted maid appeared at the door, already dressed despite the early hour, as though she too had been waiting for this exact summons. "See that this reaches Mr. Finch by the fastest courier available," Seraphina instructed, pressing the sealed letter into the maid's hands. "And tell no one, not even the dowager, that it was sent." The maid nodded once and disappeared into the corridor without a word, leaving Seraphina alone with the rising sun and the quiet certainty that the court of Ashwood, and everyone within it, was about to discover exactly how dangerous a patient woman could be. The court believed the story of the evening was over, that the scandal had come and gone with nothing more than an unusually gracious reaction from a wronged wife. They could not have been more mistaken. What had happened in the great hall that night was not the end of anything. It was only the very beginning. 3 days after the gala, a heavy frost coated the gardens of Ashwood Manor, and inside the house, tension coated everything else. Alaric had not slept properly since the night of the introduction. He paced his study until the early hours, replaying his wife's words in his mind, unable to shake the feeling that he had walked into a trap of his own making without realizing it until the door had already closed behind him. He summoned his personal secretary, a nervous young man named Peter Langley, and demanded to know everything Seraphina had done in the days since the gala. Peter, who owed his position entirely to Alaric's favor, hesitated before answering, aware that whatever he said next might place him squarely between 2 people whose conflict he wanted no part of. "She has received several letters, Your Grace," Peter said carefully, "and sent several more." "To whom?" "I do not know, sir. She has been careful. The seals are broken before they reach the household post, and she uses her own courier rather than the manor's usual service." Alaric's fingers tightened around the arm of his chair. "Find out. Your Grace, with respect, if the Duchess suspects she is being watched." "I do not care what she suspects," Alaric snapped, cutting him off. "Find out who she is writing to and find out today." Peter bowed and left the study, though his stomach twisted with unease as he did. He had served the Duke for 4 years and had never once seen him this rattled, not during the difficult harvest 2 years past, not during the tense negotiations with the northern merchants, not even during his own father's prolonged illness before the old Duke's passing. Whatever Serafina was doing, it had unsettled Alaric in a way nothing else ever had. Meanwhile, in her private sitting room on the far side of the manor, Serafina received a visitor she had not expected quite so soon. Elira Voss stood in the doorway, dressed simply this time, without the emerald silk that had announced her so dramatically at the gala, looking younger and considerably less certain of herself than she had appeared 3 nights earlier. "Lady Voss," Serafina said, setting aside the book she had been reading and gesturing to the chair across from her own. "Please sit." Elira hesitated before crossing the room and lowering herself into the offered chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I did not expect to be granted an audience so easily, Your Grace." "Why would I refuse you? You are, after all, a guest in this house." Serafina's tone remained light, but her eyes studied Elira with the same careful attention she had shown at the gala. "Tea?" "No, thank you." Elira drew a breath, steadying herself before continuing. "Your Grace, I must ask you directly because I cannot bear the uncertainty any longer. Why have you welcomed me so warmly? You have every reason to despise me, and yet you have shown me nothing but kindness since the moment I arrived. I do not understand what you want from me." Serafina regarded her for a long moment before answering, her expression unreadable. "That is a fair question, and you deserve an honest answer, or at least as honest as I am prepared to give at this moment. Tell me, Lady Voss, how much do you know about my husband's finances?" The question caught Elira entirely off guard. "His finances? I know very little, Your Grace. He has never discussed such matters with me." "No," Serafina said. "I imagine he has not. Men like Alaric rarely discuss finances with women they intend to use rather than partner with. Tell me instead what he has promised you." Elira's cheeks flushed, though whether from embarrassment or the sudden bluntness of the question, she could not have said. "He has spoken of a house of my own, a settlement, security for my future. He said that with time, once matters were arranged properly, I might even hold a title." "A title?" Serafina repeated softly, and something flickered behind her eyes that might have been pity, or might have been calculation, or perhaps both at once. "Lady Voss, has it occurred to you that my husband has made these same promises before, to other women in other years, and that not one of them ever received what they were owed?" The color drained from Elira's face. "I did not know that." "Of course you did not. Why would he tell you? It would ruin the illusion he has built so carefully around himself, the illusion of a man wronged by a cold marriage, seeking warmth and honesty elsewhere. It is a very convincing performance. I confess, even I believed it once, many years ago, before I understood him fully." "Then why," Elira asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "did you welcome me at all? Why not simply expose him, or cast me out, or do whatever it is a wronged wife is supposed to do?" Serafina rose from her chair and walked slowly toward the window, her hands clasped behind her back as she gazed out over the frost-covered gardens below. "Because casting you out would accomplish nothing except giving my husband exactly the reaction he expected, and men like Alaric are only ever undone by what they do not expect. You asked what I want from you, Lady Voss. The truth is, I do not yet want anything from you specifically. What I want is for you to understand your situation clearly, so that when the time comes, you are able to make a choice with open eyes rather than the closed ones my husband has been counting on." "What sort of choice?" Serafina turned back to face her, and for the first time since Elira had entered the room, something like genuine warmth crossed the Duchess's expression, though it was tempered by an unmistakable edge of steel beneath it. The choice between remaining a pawn in a game you did not choose to play, or becoming something considerably more difficult for my husband to control. I am not asking you to decide today. I am simply asking you to think carefully about what you truly want, separate from whatever promises have been whispered to you in the dark. Alira left the sitting room considerably more troubled than when she had entered it, though not, she realized with some surprise, angry at the Duchess. If anything, she found herself grudgingly grateful for the older woman's honesty, however unsettling it had been to hear. That evening, Alaric received a full report from Peter Langley regarding his wife's correspondence, though the information proved frustratingly incomplete. Serafina had indeed sent several letters to the capital, addressed to a solicitor named Gerald Finch, but the contents remained unknown, as she had personally overseen the sealing of each envelope and entrusted their delivery to a courier loyal only to her. Gerald Finch, Alaric repeated slowly, testing the name as though it might reveal something on its own. I do not know that name. He operates a small but respected practice near the eastern district of the capital, Your Grace, Peter offered, primarily handling matters of inheritance and property settlement from what I could discover. Alaric's expression darkened considerably. Inheritance and property settlement. Yes, Your Grace. For a long moment, Alaric said nothing, staring into the fire crackling in his study's hearth as though it might offer him some answer the flickering flames refused to provide. His mind raced through the possibilities, none of them comfortable. Was his wife attempting to secure her own financial independence in anticipation of a formal separation? Was she investigating the terms of their original marriage contract, searching for some clause he had forgotten or never fully understood? Or was it something else entirely, something he had not yet considered? Continue watching her, he instructed Peter finally, and send word to Finch's office directly. I want to know what business he has with my wife, and I want to know before the week is out. Peter bowed and departed, though he privately doubted the solicitor would reveal anything to an inquiry from the Duke's own household. Not if Serafina had gone to such careful lengths to keep her correspondence private in the first place. 3 days later, Gerald Finch himself arrived unannounced at Ashwood Manor, requesting a private audience with the Duchess under the pretense of discussing a minor property matter related to her late father's estate. Alaric, informed of the solicitor's arrival by an anxious footman, insisted on being present for the meeting, only to be politely but firmly refused entry by his own wife. This concerns my father's estate, Alaric, Serafina explained calmly as she stood in the corridor outside her private study, blocking his path with nothing more than her presence and her tone. Not yours. I see no reason for you to attend. It is my house, Serafina. I have every right to know what business is conducted within its walls. And I have every right to private counsel regarding matters of my own inheritance, she replied evenly. Unless, of course, you wish to explain to the court why the Duke of Ashwood felt it necessary to interrupt his wife's private legal consultation. I imagine that would raise a great many questions you would rather avoid. Alaric's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, watching with barely concealed frustration as his wife closed the study door behind her, leaving him standing alone in the corridor with his suspicions and no way to satisfy them. Inside the study, Gerald Finch removed a thick folder from his leather case and set it carefully on the desk between them. Your Grace, I have completed the research you requested. I must say, what I have found is considerably more significant than either of us anticipated when you first wrote to me 2 years ago. Tell me everything, Serafina said, seating herself across from him with the composed patience of someone who had waited a very long time for this exact conversation. Finch adjusted his spectacles and opened the folder, revealing pages of carefully organized documents, some old and yellowed, others clearly copied more recently in his own precise handwriting. As you suspected, the original marriage settlement between your family and house Ashwood contained a clause regarding the disposition of your dowry in the event of certain circumstances. Most solicitors, and indeed most nobility, treat such clauses as mere formality, rarely examined once a marriage has taken place. However, I have traced the specific language back to its origin, and your grace, the implications are far more substantial than a simple formality. Explain, Serafina said, leaning forward slightly. Your father, in negotiating your marriage contract, included a provision stating that should the Duke of Ashwood ever formally introduce, endow, or otherwise elevate any individual outside the marriage to a position implying inheritance rights or claim upon Ashwood properties, the entirety of your dowry, including the substantial land holdings along the northern border, would revert immediately and irrevocably to your own name, separate from the Ashwood estate entirely. Serafina sat back slowly, absorbing the full weight of what she had just heard, though her expression remained carefully controlled. My father anticipated this. It would seem so, your grace. Whether he suspected the Duke's character even before the marriage took place, or whether he simply believed in protecting his daughter's interests as a matter of prudent practice, I cannot say. But the clause is there, clearly written, properly witnessed, and entirely enforceable under current law. And the gala, Serafina said quietly, almost to herself. His public introduction of Lady Voss, describing her as a companion whom he wished to welcome formally into the life of the court. Would that satisfy the language of the clause? Finch's expression grew serious. That, your grace, is precisely the question I have spent the last 3 days examining from every possible legal angle, and I believe the answer is very likely yes, particularly given the specific wording your husband chose to use before 300 witnesses. The phrase welcome formally into the life of this court carries specific legal weight in matters of court precedent regarding acknowledged companions and their implied status. It is not identical to a formal marriage, of course, but the language your husband selected comes remarkably close to satisfying the conditions your father anticipated. Serafina closed her eyes briefly, and for the first time since the night of the gala, something like genuine emotion crossed her features, not grief, but a complicated mixture of vindication and disbelief that her late father's foresight, dismissed by so many as excessive caution at the time of her marriage negotiations, had positioned her so precisely for this exact moment. What must I do to formally invoke the clause? She asked, opening her eyes again, her voice steady once more. The process is not simple, your grace, and I must caution you that your husband will almost certainly contest it with every resource available to him. We will need to establish, before the family council, and likely before royal legal authority as well, that his public statement at the gala satisfies the specific language of the original contract. This will require testimony from witnesses present that evening, careful documentation of the exact words spoken, and a legal argument sophisticated enough to withstand whatever counterargument the Duke's own solicitors construct in response. How long? Months at minimum, your grace. Possibly longer, depending on how aggressively the Duke chooses to fight the claim, and I suspect, given what is at stake, he will fight it very aggressively indeed. Serafina nodded slowly, already calculating the path ahead with the same careful precision she had applied to every decision since the night of the gala. Then we begin immediately. I want every witness identified, and their recollections recorded before memories have time to soften or shift under pressure. I want the original marriage contract examined by a second solicitor, someone entirely unconnected to either family, to confirm your reading of the clause independently. And I want this handled with absolute discretion until we are prepared to present our case formally. If Alaric learns the full scope of what we are pursuing before we are ready, he will find some way to undermine it. Understood, your grace. Finch began gathering his documents back into the leather case, though he paused before closing it fully, looking up at Serafina with an expression of quiet respect. May I say, your grace, in all my years of practice, I have rarely encountered a client so thoroughly prepared for a battle most people would not even recognize as beginning until it was already lost. My father taught me that the most dangerous battles are the ones your opponent does not know he is fighting, Serafina replied, rising to escort him toward the door. I intend to honor that lesson fully. After Finch departed, disguising his true purpose from the household staff by discussing minor property matters within earshot of anyone listening, Serafina remained alone in her study for a long while, staring at the fire without truly seeing it. The path ahead was clearer now than it had been even a week earlier, but clarity did not make the road any less dangerous. Alaric would not surrender his position without a considerable fight, and the dowager, whatever private sympathies she might harbor for her daughter-in-law, would ultimately side with her son if the survival of the Ashwood name itself came under threat. And then there was Lyra, caught between them, increasingly aware that she had been drawn into something considerably larger and more perilous than she had ever imagined when she first agreed to accompany Alaric to the gala. Serafina had been honest with her, more honest than perhaps was strategically wise, but she had sensed something in the younger woman during their conversation, a quiet intelligence beneath the uncertainty, a capacity to understand her own situation clearly once given the chance. Whether that understanding would make Lyra an ally or an obstacle in the months ahead remained to be seen. Elsewhere in the manor, Alaric summoned his mother to his study late that evening, unable to shake the growing sense that events were moving beyond his control in ways he did not yet fully comprehend. The dowager arrived dressed in her evening robe, clearly displeased at being disturbed so late, though she said nothing of it as she settled into the chair across from her son's desk. "You look troubled," she observed simply. "Serafina met with a solicitor today, privately. She refused to allow me into the room. And you find this troubling because you do not know what was discussed, or because you suspect you already know and dislike the answer." Alaric's eyes narrowed slightly at his mother's characteristic directness, a trait she had never bothered to soften even for her own son. "What do you know, mother?" The dowager considered her answer carefully before speaking, weighing loyalties that had grown considerably more complicated over the past several days. "I know that Serafina's father was a shrewder man than most gave him credit for, and I know that when he negotiated your marriage contract, he insisted on certain provisions that your own father, may he rest peacefully, considered excessive at the time. I did not press the matter further, as it seemed unlikely such provisions would ever become relevant." Alaric leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "What provisions, mother?" "I do not recall the specific language, Alaric. It has been 10 years, and I was not privy to every detail of the negotiations." The dowager's tone remained even, though something in her eyes suggested she remembered rather more than she was currently willing to share. "But I would advise you, quite strongly, to review your original marriage contract yourself, in full, before you make any further public statements regarding Lady Voss." The color drained slowly from Alaric's face as the full weight of his mother's warning settled over him. "You believe Serafina has found something?" "I believe," the dowager said, rising from her chair with the unhurried dignity that had defined her for as long as Alaric could remember, "that your wife did not spend 10 years in this family simply to be discarded quietly and without consequence. I raised no fool as a daughter-in-law, Alaric, whatever else you may have believed about her these past years. I suggest you stop underestimating her before it costs you considerably more than your pride." She left him alone in his study, the fire burning low in the hearth, his mind racing through every word spoken at the gala, searching desperately for whatever careless phrase might have opened a door he had not even known existed until this very moment. Alaric did not sleep that night. Instead, he descended to the manor's records room, a cold, seldom-visited chamber beneath the east wing, where generations of Ashwood documents were stored in locked cabinets and iron-bound chests. He carried a single lamp, its light throwing long shadows across the rows of shelves as he searched through file after file, his hands growing increasingly unsteady as the hours wore on. He found the marriage contract shortly before dawn, tucked inside a leather case near the back of the largest cabinet, exactly where the estate steward had told him it would be kept. He carried it back to his study, spread it across his desk, and began reading by candlelight, his eyes scanning past the familiar opening clauses regarding dowry amounts and property boundaries, until he reached a section he did not recognize at all, buried deep within pages of formal legal language that he had, in truth, never read carefully at the time of his own wedding, trusting the matter entirely to his father and the family solicitors. The clause was exactly as his mother had implied, written in dense, careful legal phrasing that took him 3 full readings to fully understand. Should the Duke of Ashwood formally introduce, endow, or otherwise elevate any individual outside the marriage to a position implying inheritance rights or claim upon Ashwood properties, the entirety of the lady's dowry, including the northern landholdings specified in Schedule 3 of this agreement, shall revert immediately and irrevocably to the lady's sole ownership, independent of any claim by House Ashwood. Alaric read the passage a 4th time, hoping desperately that repetition might somehow change its meaning, but the words remained stubbornly, devastatingly clear. He thought back to the gala, to his own voice ringing across the great hall, announcing Alira as a companion whom he wished to welcome formally into the life of the court. He had chosen those words carefully, believing them elegant, dignified, a phrase that would establish Alira's position without appearing crude or dismissive of propriety. He had, quite possibly, just handed his wife the legal grounds to strip him of a fortune in land holdings that had sustained the Ashwood estate for 3 generations. He sat back in his chair, the candle guttering low beside him, and for a long while he simply stared at the document, feeling something cold and unfamiliar settle into the pit of his stomach. He had spent his entire life believing himself the architect of his own circumstances, the one who calculated, who planned, who moved others across the board of his ambitions like pieces he alone controlled. It had never once occurred to him that his own wife, quiet and composed for a full decade of marriage, might have been doing precisely the same thing all along, waiting patiently for the exact moment he would hand her the opening she needed. By morning, he had summoned his own solicitor, a sharp-tongued man named Edwin Crowley who had handled Ashwood legal matters for over 15 years, and who arrived at the manor within hours of receiving Alaric's urgent message. Crowley reviewed the contract with the same careful attention Finch had shown Seraphina days earlier, though his expression grew increasingly grim as he worked through the relevant clause. "The language is unambiguous, Your Grace," Crowley said finally, setting down the document with obvious reluctance. "I wish I could offer you better news, but I would be doing you a disservice to pretend otherwise. If the Duchess can establish, before the family council, that your public statement satisfies the conditions described in this clause, she holds legitimate legal grounds to reclaim the northern properties in full." "Can it be contested?" "Contested, yes. Successfully defended, that I am considerably less certain of. Everything will depend on witness testimony regarding the exact wording you used at the gala, and on whatever argument can be constructed to demonstrate that your statement did not, in fact, constitute a formal elevation of Lady Voss's status as the clause describes." Crowley removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes wearily. "Your Grace, if I may speak candidly, 300 guests witnessed your announcement. Many of them are precisely the sort of individuals whose testimony carries weight before a family council, lords and ladies whose word is rarely questioned. Constructing a defense against so many consistent witnesses will prove exceptionally difficult." Alaric pressed his fingers against his temples, feeling the full scope of his miscalculation settling over him like a physical weight. "What would you advise?" "Honestly, Your Grace, I would advise negotiation rather than confrontation. If the Duchess is willing to settle privately, perhaps retaining a portion of the disputed lands in exchange for withdrawing any further claims, it would spare both parties considerable expense and public embarrassment." A prolonged legal battle before the family council, particularly one this scandal has already made the subject of court gossip, will damage the Ashwood name regardless of the eventual outcome. Alaric considered this in silence for a long moment, though something in him rebelled instinctively against the idea of negotiating from a position of weakness with a woman he had, until recently, considered entirely beneath his notice in matters of strategy. Still, he recognized the wisdom in Crowley's counsel, even as pride made it bitter to swallow. "I will consider it," he said finally, though both men in the room understood this to mean he had no intention of surrendering easily. Across the manor, unaware of the legal storm gathering around her, Elira spent the following days in a state of restless uncertainty, torn between the comfortable life Alaric had promised her and the increasingly unsettling realization that she understood almost nothing about the true dynamics of the household she now found herself residing within. She sought out Serafina again 3 days after their first private conversation, finding the Duchess in the manor's small library, seated near a window with a book open on her lap, though she did not appear to be reading it. "May I speak with you again, Your Grace?" Serafina looked up and gestured to the chair beside her without hesitation. "Of course, Lady Voss." "Sit." Elira lowered herself into the offered seat, twisting her hands together nervously before finally speaking. "I have thought a great deal about what you said to me, about choices, and about what my situation truly is, separate from what I have been promised." "And what have you concluded?" "I do not know," Elira admitted quietly. "I came here believing Alaric loved me, or at least cared for me enough to offer me a life I could never have built for myself otherwise. I grew up with very little, Your Grace. My family struggled for every meal, every winter coat, every small comfort other people take entirely for granted. When Alaric first began paying attention to me, promising security, a title, a future free from the fear I grew up with, I did not stop to question whether his promises were genuine. I simply wanted, desperately, for them to be true." Serafina's expression softened slightly, though the careful watchfulness never entirely left her eyes. "That is not a foolish desire, Lady Voss. Security is not a small thing to want, particularly for someone who has known its absence so intimately. My criticism is not of your wanting security. It is of my husband's willingness to promise it to you while having no genuine intention of ever delivering it." "How can you be so certain he does not intend to keep his promises?" "Because I have watched him make similar promises before," Serafina said simply. "Not to you specifically, but to others in years past. There was a woman named Cassandra 3 years before you arrived, and before her, a woman whose name I never learned, though I heard enough of the household gossip to understand the pattern clearly. Alaric grows bored eventually, Lady Voss. He always does. And when he does, the promises he made so passionately in the beginning simply evaporate, and the woman who believed them finds herself with nothing at all, no title, no settlement, no protection, only the scandal of having been his companion and the difficulty of rebuilding a respectable life afterward." Elira felt something cold settle in her chest as she absorbed this information, though she found herself unable to fully disbelieve it, not after everything else she had observed since arriving at Ashwood Manor. "Why are you telling me this? What benefit is it to you if I understand my situation clearly?" Serafina closed her book fully and set it aside, turning to face Elira directly. "Because I believe, Lady Voss, that you and I may eventually find ourselves with considerably more in common than either of us expected when you first walked into that hall on my husband's arm. We have both, in our own ways, been treated as instruments in service of Alaric's ambitions, rather than as people whose own desires and futures matter in their own right. I do not know yet whether that shared understanding will make us allies, or simply two women who happen to recognize the same truth at different points in their lives. But I believe you deserve the chance to decide your own path, with full knowledge of the ground beneath your feet, rather than continuing to walk blindly toward whatever future my husband has vaguely gestured at without ever committing to specifics. The two women sat in silence for a long moment after that, the fire crackling softly in the library's small hearth, each considering the other with a wariness that had, almost imperceptibly, begun to soften into something closer to cautious respect. "What would you have me do?" Elira asked finally. "Nothing for now," Serafina replied. "Simply continue observing, continue asking questions of him and of yourself. And when the moment comes that you must choose a side in whatever conflict is building within these walls, choose it because you understand clearly what each side offers, not because you have been told what to believe by someone with their own interests at stake, myself included." It was, Elira thought as she left the library that afternoon, perhaps the most honest advice anyone within Ashwood Manor had offered her since her arrival, and it left her with far more questions than answers, though for the first time since the gala, she felt as though she was finally beginning to see the shape of the game being played around her, even if she remained uncertain of her own role within it. That evening, Alaric requested a private meeting with Serafina in the Manor's formal drawing room, a space rarely used except for the most significant of family discussions. He arrived first, pacing before the fireplace with barely contained agitation, and when Serafina finally entered, composed and unhurried as always, he wasted no time on pleasantries. "I have read the marriage contract," he said without preamble. "Have you?" Serafina's tone remained perfectly neutral as she seated herself across from him, folding her hands calmly in her lap. "You know precisely what I mean, Serafina. Do not pretend otherwise." "I have never pretended anything with you, Alaric, though you have certainly given me ample reason to wish I could pretend this marriage was something other than what it has become." She met his gaze steadily. "Yes, I know what the contract contains. My father ensured I understood every clause before I ever signed my name beside yours 10 years ago." Alaric stopped pacing, turning to face her fully, his expression a complicated mixture of anger and something almost like grudging admiration, though pride prevented him from voicing the latter. "You planned this. From the very beginning, you knew this clause existed, and you have simply been waiting, all these years, for me to give you the opportunity to invoke it." "I have been waiting," Serafina corrected calmly, "for you to reveal your true character clearly enough that no one, not the court, not your mother, not even you yourself, could pretend otherwise any longer. I did not force you to bring Lady Voss to that gala, Alaric. I did not force you to stand before 300 witnesses and declare your intention to welcome her formally into the life of this court. Every choice that has led us to this moment was entirely your own. And if I contest the clause, if I fight this in every court available to me—" "Then you will fight it," Serafina said simply, rising from her chair with unhurried grace. "And I will meet you there prepared, as I have been prepared for considerably longer than you seem to realize. But I would advise you, husband, to consider very carefully whether that is truly the battle you wish to wage, given how thoroughly you have already lost the opening exchange." She left him alone in the drawing room, the fire casting long shadows across the walls, and for the second time in less than a week, Alaric found himself staring at his own reflection in darkened glass. Searching for answers to a conflict, he was only now beginning to fully understand he had started long before he ever recognized it as a conflict at all. Word of the dispute between the Duke and Duchess of Ashwood could not remain confined within the manor walls for long, not in a court where servants moved between households carrying news along with linens and letters, and within a fortnight, whispers had spread through every drawing room and dinner table from the capital to the farthest country estates. The story shifted with each retelling, growing more elaborate with distance from its source, until some versions claimed Serafina intended to have her husband stripped of his title entirely, while others insisted the Duchess had gone quietly mad and was inventing legal claims that existed nowhere but in her own imagination. Alaric found the rumors excruciating, each version more damaging to his reputation than the last, and he grew increasingly desperate to control the narrative before it slipped entirely beyond his reach. He began appearing at social gatherings with renewed frequency, laughing too loudly, speaking too confidently of matters entirely unrelated to his marriage, as though sheer performance might convince the court that nothing was amiss within Ashwood Manor. It fooled almost no one. Lord Edmund Clark, who had witnessed the original announcement at the gala, found himself approached by no fewer than 6 different acquaintances within a single week, each hoping he might confirm or deny the various rumors circulating about the Duke's marriage. He grew tired of the questions quickly, though he answered honestly each time, recounting exactly what he had seen and heard that night without embellishment, understanding on some instinctive level that his testimony, however casually offered over wine and cards, was steadily becoming part of a record that mattered considerably more than idle gossip. He said the words clearly, Edmund told his companion one evening at a private card game, keeping his voice low despite the general noise of the room around them. I heard them myself, welcome formally into the life of this court. There was no mistaking his meaning, whatever he might claim now. His companion, a cautious woman named Lady Winifred Price, who had long harbored her own private opinions about the Duke's character, nodded slowly. The Duchess has always struck me as considerably more clever than she is given credit for. I confess, I did not expect her to move against him quite this directly, but I cannot say I am entirely surprised either. Such conversations repeated themselves across the court in countless variations, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, public sympathy began shifting in a direction Alaric had never anticipated when he first decided to introduce a lyra at the gala. He had believed, with the confidence of a man who had never truly been challenged, that society would eventually accept his choices as simply the natural prerogative of a powerful duke, and that his wife's quiet dignity would be interpreted as resignation rather than the opening move of a calculated campaign. Instead, the court began to see Seraphina not as a wronged wife quietly enduring humiliation, but as a woman of remarkable composure and hidden strength, someone who had waited patiently through years of disrespect before finally revealing the full extent of her preparation. The narrative that emerged, whispered from parlor to parlor with growing conviction, painted Alaric increasingly as a man who had underestimated his own wife catastrophically, and who was now discovering, far too late, the consequences of that miscalculation. Seraphina, for her part, made no public statements regarding the matter, refusing every invitation to discuss her marriage even when pressed directly by acquaintances who considered themselves close enough to ask. Her silence, rather than fueling further speculation as Alaric had hoped it might, only deepened the court's growing respect for her, as though her restraint itself constituted a kind of quiet dignity that spoke louder than any explanation she might have offered. Meanwhile, Gerald Finch worked steadily through the process of gathering formal witness testimony, traveling personally to interview several of the more prominent guests who had attended the gala, securing written and signed accounts of exactly what Alaric had said and how he had said it. Each account, gathered independently and without the witnesses knowing precisely how their testimony would be used, corroborated the others with remarkable consistency, leaving little room for Alaric's solicitors to argue that the Duke's words had been somehow misheard or misremembered. The case builds itself stronger with each passing week, Your Grace, Finch reported to Seraphina during one of their regular private consultations, held now with considerably more caution given the household's heightened awareness of their meetings. I have secured formal statements from 11 separate witnesses, including 2 members of the royal court whose testimony carries particular weight given their reputation for careful, unbiased observation. The Duke's solicitors will find it exceedingly difficult to construct a credible counter-narrative against such consistent and well-regarded testimony. And the family council. When might we expect a formal hearing to be scheduled? That, Your Grace, depends considerably on your husband's willingness to proceed, or his continued efforts to delay. I understand from my contacts within the council's administrative office that his solicitors have already filed 2 separate requests for postponement, citing the need for additional preparation time. I suspect this reflects less genuine need and more a hope that public attention might fade if the matter is sufficiently delayed. Serafina considered this information carefully, weighing the advantages and disadvantages of pressing for an accelerated timeline against allowing her husband the rope with which he seemed determined to hang himself through continued public missteps. "Do not press too hard for an immediate hearing, Mr. Finch. Let him delay if he wishes. Every week that passes, the court's sympathy shifts further in my favor, and every desperate maneuver he attempts in the meantime only strengthens our position further. Patience has served me well thus far. I see no reason to abandon it now." Finch nodded, though something in his expression suggested a growing curiosity about precisely how his client had developed such remarkable strategic patience, a quality he rarely encountered even among the most experienced political operators he had worked alongside over the years. "As you wish, Your Grace, though I would caution that patience alone will not win this case. We must continue building our evidence steadily, regardless of when the hearing itself is finally scheduled." "Of course," Serafina agreed, "which brings me to a matter I wish to discuss with you today. I want you to look into something else entirely, something unrelated to the marriage contract itself." "Your Grace, I want to know the full extent of my husband's personal debts," Serafina said, her voice dropping slightly, though her composure never wavered. "Not the estate's finances, which are managed jointly and which I already understand reasonably well, but his own personal obligations, incurred separately, particularly any debts related to gambling or to maintaining companions such as Lady Voss and her predecessors." Finch's eyebrows rose slightly at the request, though he recovered his professional composure quickly. "May I ask the purpose of such an inquiry, Your Grace? It falls somewhat outside the scope of our current legal proceedings regarding the dowry clause." "Consider it insurance, Mr. Finch," Serafina replied simply. "My husband is not a man who surrenders easily, and I suspect that when he finally recognizes the full weakness of his legal position regarding the dowry clause, he will turn to less legitimate means of resisting the consequences. I wish to understand the full landscape of his vulnerabilities before that moment arrives, so that I am prepared to respond regardless of which direction he chooses to strike." Finch studied her for a long moment, a flicker of genuine admiration crossing his otherwise carefully neutral expression. "Your Grace, I have represented a great many clients over the course of my career, some of them considerably more experienced in matters of legal strategy than yourself, given your relative youth. I must say, I have rarely encountered anyone who approaches conflict with quite the same combination of patience and thoroughness that you have demonstrated throughout this entire matter. My father used to say that most people lose their battles not through lack of strength, but through lack of preparation," Serafina said quietly, a rare hint of genuine emotion crossing her features at the mention of her father, gone now nearly 4 years but whose lessons continued to guide her through every decision. "I do not intend to lose this particular battle through any failure of my own preparation, Mr. Finch, whatever else might happen along the way." As the weeks progressed and Finch continued his quiet investigation into Alaric's personal finances, Alaric himself grew increasingly desperate, sensing the shifting tide of public opinion even as he struggled to identify any effective countermeasure. He summoned Edwin Crowley repeatedly, demanding updates on possible legal defenses, though each consultation left him more frustrated than the last as Crowley continued to offer the same cautious counsel regarding negotiation rather than confrontation. "I will not simply hand her the northern properties without a fight," Alaric insisted during one particularly tense meeting, pacing his study with the restless energy of a man who had not slept well in weeks. "There must be some avenue of defense we have not yet fully explored." "Your Grace, I have examined every precedent available regarding similar clauses in marriage contracts across the past several decades," Crowley replied wearily, clearly having exhausted his patience with the Duke's refusal to accept the gravity of his situation. In each comparable case, when public testimony has been this consistent and this substantial, the courts have ruled in favor of the party invoking the clause. I understand this is difficult to accept, Your Grace, but continuing to pursue a losing legal strategy will only compound the damage to your reputation and your finances alike. Then perhaps, Alaric said slowly, an idea forming that he had resisted considering until this exact moment. The solution lies not in the legal argument itself, but in undermining the witnesses who support it. Crowley's expression grew wary. Your Grace, I would strongly caution against any action that might be construed as witness intimidation. Such actions, if discovered, would damage your position far more severely than simply accepting the clause's enforcement ever could. I am not suggesting intimidation, Crowley. I am suggesting persuasion. Surely there are ways to encourage certain witnesses to reconsider the precision of their recollections, particularly those whose loyalty to my family has been long established through years of mutual benefit. Crowley remained silent for a long moment, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken, though ultimately unwilling to directly refuse his client's instructions. I would advise extreme caution, Your Grace, and I would strongly recommend that any such efforts remain entirely separate from my own involvement in this matter. My professional reputation cannot survive association with anything that might later be characterized as improper influence over sworn testimony. Alaric dismissed him shortly afterward, already turning over in his mind exactly which witnesses might prove most susceptible to reconsideration, beginning with those whose families depended most heavily on Ashwood patronage for their continued prosperity. It was, he told himself, simply a matter of reminding certain individuals where their true loyalties ought to lie, nothing more sinister than that. His first attempt, made discreetly through an intermediary rather than directly, targeted a minor lord named Cedric Hollies, whose family estate bordered Ashwood lands and who had, in the past, benefited considerably from the Duke's goodwill regarding certain boundary disputes. The approach was subtle, framed as a friendly reminder of past favors rather than any explicit threat, but Hollies understood the implication clearly enough, and he found himself caught uncomfortably between his genuine recollection of events at the gala and his awareness of exactly how much his family's continued prosperity depended on maintaining good relations with House Ashwood. He did not immediately refuse the implicit request to soften his testimony, but neither did he agree, promising only that he would consider the matter carefully before Finch's associates arrived to formally record his statement. This hesitation, though Alaric did not know it, reached Seraphina's ears within days, carried by a servant in Hollies's own household who happened to be distantly related to one of Seraphina's most trusted maids, the web of loyalty and gossip among servants proving, as it so often did, considerably more effective at gathering intelligence than any formal investigation could have achieved. He is attempting to influence witnesses, Seraphina said flatly upon receiving this information, meeting privately with Finch in the Manor's library late one evening after the household had largely retired for the night. It is a foolish and dangerous strategy, Your Grace, though not entirely surprising given his evident desperation, Finch replied. If we can establish proof of such interference, it would substantially strengthen our position before the Council, demonstrating not only the validity of the original claim but also the Duke's willingness to act improperly in attempting to suppress it. Then let us ensure such proof exists, Seraphina said, her voice carrying a new edge of determination. I want Lord Hollies approached directly, not through intermediaries, and I want him offered clear assurance that his honest testimony will carry no risk to his family's interests, regardless of whatever pressure my husband has attempted to apply. And if the Duke discovers we have countered his approach, then he will understand, finally, that I am prepared to match him at every turn, in every arena he chooses to fight within, Seraphina replied. Perhaps that understanding will finally convince him to abandon this futile campaign of interference before it damages his position beyond any hope of recovery. Finch nodded and rose to begin making the necessary arrangements, though before he departed, he paused at the library door, turning back to regard Seraphina with genuine curiosity. "Your Grace, if I may ask a question somewhat removed from our legal proceedings, do you regret it? The marriage, I mean, looking back now, knowing everything you know about your husband's character." Seraphina considered the question for a long moment, staring into the dying embers of the library's fireplace before answering. "Regret implies a choice made poorly, Mr. Finch. I was 17 years old when this marriage was arranged, with little genuine say in the matter beyond my father's careful negotiation of terms designed to protect me regardless of what my husband might eventually become. I do not know if I would call it regret precisely. I would call it, perhaps, a slow and difficult education in exactly what my father was trying to teach me all those years ago, an education I am only now, after 10 years, finally putting to its intended use." Finch offered a small, respectful bow before departing, leaving Seraphina alone with her thoughts and the slowly dying fire, contemplating the strange and unexpected path that had led her from a frightened 17-year-old bride to the composed, calculating woman who now sat quietly plotting the systematic dismantling of her husband's carefully constructed deceptions. 2 days later, Lord Hollies received a private visit from Seraphina herself, accompanied only by a single trusted attendant, an unusual breach of typical social protocol that immediately signaled the seriousness of her purpose. She met with him in his own study, declining refreshment, coming directly to the point with the same directness that had come to characterize her handling of the entire affair. "Lord Hollies, I understand my husband has approached you regarding your recollection of events at the winter gala." Hollies, a man in his middle years with a nervous disposition that had only worsened considerably since Alaric's intermediary first approached him, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Your Grace, I would prefer not to discuss." "I'm not asking you to discuss anything you are uncomfortable sharing, Lord Hollies," Seraphina interrupted gently. "I am simply here to offer you an assurance. Whatever concerns you might harbor regarding your family's relationship with House Ashwood, I want you to understand clearly that your honest testimony regarding what you witnessed that evening will carry no negative consequence for your family's standing or prosperity, regardless of the eventual outcome of this dispute. I do not ask you to lie in my favor, nor do I ask you to exaggerate what you witnessed. I ask only that you speak honestly, without fear, and trust that honesty itself will be sufficient." Holly studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the genuine sincerity in her voice against the implicit threat he had perceived, whether accurately or not, in the Duke's earlier approach. "Your Grace, I confess I do not entirely understand why you have taken the trouble to visit me personally over this matter." "Because honesty deserves protection, Lord Hollies, particularly when powerful men attempt to suppress it through implication and pressure rather than genuine argument. I have watched my husband build an entire life around the assumption that people will bend to his will simply because bending seems safer than resisting. I intend to demonstrate, quite thoroughly, that this assumption is no longer entirely accurate, at least not within the boundaries of this particular conflict." When Finch's associate arrived the following week to formally record Hollies's testimony, the account he provided proved every bit as clear and damaging to Alaric's position as the other 11 statements already gathered, confirming precisely the words spoken at the gala without hesitation or qualification. Word of Seraphina's personal visit, and the courage it had apparently restored in a witness Alaric had hoped to quietly neutralize, spread through the court with predictable speed, further cementing the growing narrative of a Duchess who could not be intimidated, manipulated, or dismissed. Alaric, upon learning of his failed attempt through channels considerably less discreet than he had hoped, understood finally that his wife had not simply anticipated his legal challenge. She had anticipated every conceivable countermeasure he might attempt to employ against it, and she had prepared responses to each one with a thoroughness that left him feeling, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely and completely outmaneuvered. He retreated to his study that evening in a state of quiet, simmering fury, pouring himself a drink he did not particularly want, staring into the fire with the growing, unwelcome understanding that the woman he had married for practical convenience, and subsequently treated with careless disregard for a full decade had, all along, possessed a mind considerably sharper, and a will considerably stronger than he had ever bothered to notice. The realization did not soften him toward her. If anything, it hardened something cold and vindictive within him, a determination that whatever the eventual legal outcome, he would find some way to ensure Serafina paid a price for humiliating him so thoroughly before the entire court. He simply did not yet know what form that price might take, or how far he might be willing to go in order to extract it. In the days that followed his failed attempt to influence Lord Holly's, Alaric turned his attention toward Alira, reasoning that if he could not undermine the witnesses to his own declaration, he might instead undermine the declaration's significance itself by convincing Alira to publicly distance herself from any claim of formal status within his household. He summoned her to his private study one evening, dismissing the servants and closing the heavy door behind them with a finality that made Alira's stomach tighten with unease. "I need your help," he said without preamble, pouring himself a drink but not offering one to her. "With what, Alaric?" "The court believes my introduction of you at the gala carried some formal legal weight, some implication of permanent status. I need you to make clear, publicly if necessary, that no such implication was ever intended, that you understand yourself simply as a companion, nothing more, with no claim upon this household or its properties." Alira felt something cold settle in her chest as she processed his request, recognizing immediately the position he was asking her to occupy, a position that would strip away whatever fragile dignity she had begun to construct for herself since arriving at Ashwood Manor, reducing her once again to something temporary and disposable, exactly as Serafina had warned her he eventually would. "You are asking me to declare myself worth nothing," she said slowly, "in order to protect your finances." "I am asking you to clarify a simple misunderstanding," Alaric replied, though even he seemed to hear the hollowness in his own justification. "Nothing more." "And what happens to me afterward? Once I have publicly declared myself nothing more than a passing companion, what becomes of the promises you made me? The house, the settlement, the eventual title you spoke of so confidently when you first convinced me to leave everything I knew behind and come here." Alaric hesitated, and that hesitation told Alira everything she needed to know, more clearly than any words could have. "Those arrangements remain unaffected by this particular legal matter," he said finally, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried during their earlier conversations, before the gala, before everything had grown so complicated. "You are lying to me," Alira said quietly, though there was no anger in her voice, only a weary, resigned clarity that surprised even herself. "You have been lying to me from the very beginning, exactly as your wife warned me you would. My wife has clearly poisoned your thinking against me. Your wife has told me only what I should have recognized myself, had I not been so desperate to believe in a future that sounded too perfect to be entirely genuine." Alira rose from her chair, her hands trembling slightly though her voice remained steady. "I will not lie for you, Alaric, not to protect your fortune, and certainly not at the cost of whatever small dignity I have left." She left his study before he could respond further, walking quickly through the darkened corridors of the manor toward the guest chamber that had become, however uncomfortably, something resembling a temporary home, her mind racing with the full weight of what she had just recognized about the man she had once believed loved her. She did not go directly to Serafina that night, needing time alone to fully absorb the collapse of illusions she had carried with her since first meeting Alaric nearly a year earlier. But 3 days later, having turned the matter over in her mind repeatedly, weighing every angle of her increasingly precarious situation, she finally sought out the Duchess once more, finding her this time in the manor's private garden, walking slowly along the frost-hardened paths despite the winter chill. "Your Grace, I must speak with you." Serafina turned, studying Alira's expression carefully before nodding and gesturing for her to fall into step beside her along the garden path. "You look troubled, Lady Voss, more troubled than usual, I mean." "Alaric asked me to publicly deny any formal status in this household. He wanted me to declare myself nothing more than a passing companion, in order to weaken the legal weight of his declaration at the gala." Something flickered across Serafina's expression, though whether it was surprise or simple confirmation of expectations already held, Alira could not quite determine. "And what did you tell him?" "I refused." Alira drew a steadying breath before continuing. "Your Grace, I understand now clearly that whatever future Alaric promised me was never genuine. I do not know what that means for my situation going forward, but I know I will not lie on his behalf, not after everything I have come to understand about his character these past weeks." Serafina stopped walking, turning to face Alira fully, her expression softening into something Alira had not yet seen from the composed Duchess, a genuine warmth that seemed entirely separate from calculation or strategy. "That took considerable courage, Lady Voss, particularly given how much you stand to lose by refusing him." "I have already lost everything he promised me," Alira replied simply. "Refusing him costs me nothing further, except perhaps whatever small comfort might have come from continuing to believe a comfortable lie." "Then let me offer you something in its place," Serafina said, resuming their walk along the garden path at a slower pace. "I cannot promise you a title, Lady Voss, nor the fortune my husband so carelessly dangled before you, but I can offer you honest employment within my own household, once these current matters are settled, along with a genuine reference and fair wages, sufficient to build a respectable and independent life for yourself, free from dependence on any man's fickle promises." Alira stopped walking entirely, staring at Serafina with an expression of genuine astonishment. "You would offer me employment? After everything?" "You are not the architect of this situation, Lady Voss, whatever role you played within it. You were, as I told you weeks ago, a piece placed upon a board by a man who saw you as useful rather than valuable in your own right. I do not hold you responsible for choices he made unilaterally, choices you were led to believe reflected genuine affection rather than calculated convenience." Serafina's expression grew momentarily distant, as though recalling some private memory of her own. "I understand better than most, Lady Voss, exactly how it feels to discover that a man's promises were never as solid as they appeared." Alira felt something tighten in her throat, an unexpected wave of emotion at the unexpected kindness being offered by a woman who had every reason in the world to despise her rather than extend genuine compassion. "Thank you, Your Grace. I do not know how to properly express how much that offer means to me, particularly now." "You need not express anything beyond honesty, Lady Voss. That is all I have ever asked of you, and it is all I will continue to ask, regardless of how the coming weeks unfold." Serafina resumed walking, and after a moment, Alira fell into step beside her once more, the two women continuing their circuit of the frost-covered garden in a silence that had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from wary tolerance into something that might, given enough time, grow into genuine trust. Word of Alira's refusal to support Alaric's attempted narrative reached the Duke within hours, delivered by a servant who had overheard fragments of their heated conversation, and sensing the shifting tides within the household, had chosen to report the exchange directly to Alaric rather than risk appearing disloyal by remaining silent. Alaric received the news with a fury that startled even the servant delivering it, though he said nothing in the moment, simply dismissing the servant with a curt wave and retreating once more into the isolated silence of his study. He understood now, with a clarity he found deeply unwelcome, that he had lost control of every element of the situation he had originally set into motion. His wife had outmaneuvered him legally. His own mother had sided, at least implicitly, with the woman he had wronged rather than the son whose interests she had spent a lifetime protecting. And now even Alira, the woman he had believed thoroughly devoted to him, had chosen honesty over loyalty when finally forced to choose between them. He poured himself another drink, his third of the evening, and began turning over increasingly desperate possibilities in his mind, searching for some avenue of resistance that had not yet been anticipated and countered by his infuriatingly well-prepared wife. He thought of the northern properties, the land that had sustained 3 generations of Ashwood prosperity, and felt a fresh wave of anger at the prospect of losing them entirely due to what he still, even now, could not fully accept as his own catastrophic miscalculation. There had to be some way to salvage the situation, he told himself, some angle he had not yet considered. He simply had not found it yet. 3 days later, an idea began forming in his mind, one considerably more drastic than anything he had previously attempted, born from desperation rather than careful strategy, and considerably more dangerous than he fully appreciated in the moment he first began to consider it seriously. The dowager noticed the change in her son almost immediately, a certain restless quality to his movements, a distracted quality to his conversation, that she recognized from years of watching him navigate difficult circumstances throughout his life. She found him alone in his study late one afternoon, staring out the window toward the northern fields that had become the center of so much recent conflict, and she closed the door quietly behind her before speaking. "You are planning something," she said simply, settling into the chair across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. "I am simply thinking, Mother." "You have never simply thought about anything in your entire life, Alaric. You have always calculated, schemed, searched for advantage even in matters that required none. I know that expression on your face, and I confess it worries me considerably more than your earlier anger did." Alaric turned from the window to regard his mother directly, his expression carefully guarded. "Would it trouble you, Mother, if I told you I intend to fight for what remains of this family's dignity, by whatever means prove necessary?" "It would trouble me if those means proved reckless enough to cause damage beyond what has already been done," the dowager replied evenly. "You have already lost considerable ground in this conflict, Alaric, through choices made carelessly and without proper consideration of consequence. I would strongly advise against compounding that damage through further recklessness born of wounded pride rather than genuine strategy." "You continue to side with her." "I side with reason, Alaric, which happens, in this particular matter, to align rather more closely with your wife's position than with yours. That is not a betrayal of my loyalty to you as my son. It is simply an honest assessment of the circumstances as they actually stand, rather than as you might wish them to be." The dowager rose from her chair, moving toward the door before pausing and turning back to face him one final time. "Whatever you are considering, Alaric, I urge you to think very carefully before proceeding. Serafina has demonstrated repeatedly and thoroughly that she anticipates your moves before you make them. I would not wager against her continuing to do so, particularly if your next move is born more from desperation than from careful thought." She left him alone once more, and Alaric sat in silence for a long while after her departure, turning the idea over in his mind despite his mother's warning, unable to fully abandon the growing conviction that only a bold and unexpected action might yet salvage his rapidly deteriorating position. He thought of old associates from his years at university, men who now held positions of influence within the royal court itself, men who might, given sufficient incentive, prove willing to intervene in a family council matter on his behalf, bypassing the more predictable channels his wife had so thoroughly prepared for. It was a dangerous path, he understood that much clearly, one that risked drawing royal attention to a matter he had originally hoped to keep contained within the more forgiving boundaries of family council proceedings. But desperation, he told himself, sometimes required desperate measures, and he had run out of more conventional options to pursue. That evening, he composed a careful letter to an old acquaintance from his university years, a man named Lord Percival Ashby, who now held a minor but useful position within the royal legal administration, requesting a private meeting to discuss what he vaguely described as a matter of considerable delicacy and mutual benefit. He sealed the letter himself, entrusting it to a courier he believed loyal beyond question, unaware that this very courier, like so many others throughout the household staff, maintained quiet connections to individuals within Serafina's growing network of informants. Word of the letter and its intended recipient reached Serafina within 2 days, delivered through the same web of servant loyalty that had already proven so consistently valuable throughout the unfolding conflict. She read the report carefully, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed, before summoning Finch for an urgent private consultation. "My husband is attempting to involve royal legal administration in our dispute," she informed him without preamble once he arrived. "Specifically, a man named Lord Percival Ashby." Finch's expression grew immediately serious. "Ashby, Your Grace. I know the name. He holds a position within the Royal Court's Legal Review Office, though his actual influence over family council proceedings is considerably more limited than your husband likely believes. Ashby has, however, a reputation for being susceptible to certain forms of persuasion, provided the incentive proves sufficiently generous." "Then we must ensure my husband's approach fails," Serafina said, "before it has the opportunity to complicate matters further." "May I ask how you intend to accomplish that, Your Grace?" Serafina considered the question carefully before answering, her mind already working through the various possibilities available to her. "I believe, Mr. Finch, that it is time I paid a visit to the capital myself, rather than continuing to manage this matter entirely through correspondence and intermediaries. If my husband intends to seek influence through personal connections, I see no reason I should not do precisely the same, particularly given that my own family maintains connections within the royal court considerably more substantial than whatever minor acquaintance my husband has cultivated with Lord Ashby." "Your Grace, if I may ask, what connections do you refer to specifically?" A small, careful smile crossed Serafina's features, the first genuine hint of confidence she had allowed herself to show in days. "My father, Mr. Finch, was not merely a wealthy landowner with a shrewd eye for legal protections within marriage contracts. He was, for many years before his passing, a trusted advisor to the Crown itself, and the connections he built during those years have not entirely faded simply because he is no longer alive to maintain them personally. I believe it is time I called upon some of those connections directly, rather than continuing to rely solely on the family council process my husband seems increasingly determined to circumvent." Finch studied her with an expression of renewed and considerable respect, understanding now, more fully than before, exactly how deep and carefully constructed Serafina's preparation for this conflict truly extended. "Your Grace, I confess I continue to underestimate the full scope of your resources, despite having worked alongside you for several months now." "Then perhaps, Mr. Finch," Serafina replied, rising from her chair with quiet determination, "it is time my husband learned the same lesson considerably more thoroughly than he has thus far." She began making preparations that same evening for a journey to the capital, a journey she had, in truth, anticipated might eventually become necessary, though she had hoped to avoid the complication and expense of traveling so far from Ashwood Manor, while the household remained in such a delicate state of unresolved tension. But Alaric's decision to seek royal influence left her little choice but to respond in kind, drawing upon resources she had kept carefully in reserve since the very beginning of the conflict, waiting for precisely the moment when their use might prove most decisive. As she packed her belongings that night, assisted by her most trusted maid, Serafina found herself reflecting on how completely the past several weeks had transformed not only her circumstances, but her own understanding of herself. She had entered this conflict as a wronged wife, quietly determined to claim what her father's foresight had secured for her. She was leaving it, or rather, continuing deeper into it, as something considerably more formidable, a woman fully prepared to match her husband's every desperate maneuver with calculated precision of her own, drawing upon resources and connections she had spent years quietly cultivating against exactly this eventuality. Whatever Alaric hoped to accomplish through his approach to Lord Ashby, she intended to ensure it accomplished nothing at all, and she intended to ensure it in the one place where her own preparation, patience, and connections would prove most decisively superior to anything her husband could hope to muster in response. The journey to the capital would take 2 full days by carriage, and as dawn broke over Ashwood Manor the following morning, Seraphina departed quietly, accompanied only by her most trusted attendant and a small escort of guards loyal to her personally rather than to the Ashwood household more broadly, leaving behind a manor still very much unaware of exactly how far this conflict was about to extend beyond its walls.